Hello, good morning. This is BBC News with me, Ben Brown, here live at Westminster with all the very latest political developments. Rishi Sunak is to hold his first cabinet meeting this morning in about half an hour's time after a major reshuffle of ministers, and he's been warning of tough choices ahead.
I will place economic stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. This will mean difficult decisions to come.
Controversially, Suella Braverman is back as Home Secretary, despite having broken the ministerial code last week. The Foreign Secretary says the new Prime Minister wants an experienced team around him.
And it's clear that Suella knows the Home Office, having very recently been there, and is able to hit the ground running from day one.
The new Prime Minister's already spoken to the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales in what is being seen as an attempt to improve relations with the devolved administrations. And at noon today, Rishi Sunak faces his first big parliamentary test in the new job at Prime Minister's Questions. We'll have live coverage of that. Hello, very good morning to you. Welcome to BBC News. We're live here in Westminster all day on the first full day of Rishi Sunak's premiership. The new Prime Minister will hold his first cabinet meeting this morning, we think in about half an hour's time, after a major reshuffle of ministers. After a day of hiring and firing, we now know who will be joining him around the cabinet table. Mr. Sunak has brought back several experienced ministers. But perhaps the most controversial appointment was the return of Suella Braverman as Home Secretary only 6 days after she resigned over a security breach at the Home Office. Well, as expected, Jeremy Hunt stays on as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Mr. Hunt and the Prime Minister are said to be considering whether the financial statement that's currently scheduled for Monday will take place. Some reports that it might be delayed. And James Cleverly stays on as Foreign Secretary. He backed Boris Johnson in the leadership contest. Steve Barclay is appointed as Health Secretary for the second time this year, replacing Therese Coffey. Dominic Raab is back on the front bench in a role that's very familiar to him. He's Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary once again. The leadership contender who dropped out of the race just before nominations closed, Penny Mordaunt, remains leader of the House of Commons. Now, some of her supporters were really hoping that she'd get a higher profile job than that, perhaps Foreign Secretary. She hasn't. She's still leader of the House. And Michael Gove returns to the Cabinet as Levelling Up Secretary after being dramatically sacked by Boris Johnson back in July. Well, after this morning's first Cabinet meeting, Mr. Sunak will also take part in his first Prime Minister's Questions in the Commons. Just behind me, our political correspondent Jonathan Blake has this report.
On day one as Prime Minister, among Rishi Sunak's first tasks in office, phone calls with other world leaders. Mr. Sunak spoke last night to US President Joe Biden and President Zelensky of Ukraine. There were calls too with the First Minister of Scotland, which Nicola Sturgeon described as constructive, and the Welsh First Minister Mark Drakeford, who said the UK's urgent challenges were discussed. Earlier, Rishi Sunak said he'd been elected partly to fix the mistakes made by his predecessor Liz Truss. He promised hope, but warned there'd be difficult decisions ahead.
I will place economic stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. This will mean difficult decisions to come. Right now, our country is facing a profound economic crisis. The aftermath of COVID still lingers. Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets and supply chains the world over.
There's a familiar look to Mr. Sunak's top team. Most of the faces around the cabinet table served under Liz Truss or Boris Johnson. Jeremy Hunt remains as Chancellor, the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly stays in post, and Ben Wallace continues as Defence Secretary. Suella Braverman's return as Home Secretary, less than a week after she resigned over a security breach, drew immediate criticism from Labour. Michael Gove makes a comeback too to his previous post as Levelling Up Secretary, and Dominic Raab picks up two of his old jobs, Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary. It's all about continuity, says Downing Street. Opposition parties argue more of the same is not good.
We've had 12 years now of Conservative failure, and we're now on to our third Conservative Prime Minister in 3 months. They don't have a mandate to govern. Rishi Sunak himself has no mandate.
The real problem we have, this isn't one Prime Minister changing during the lifetime of a Parliament. This is the third Prime Minister in the space of 2 months.
Rishi Sunak has asked today for the British people to trust him. Yet the Conservatives won't put their trust in the British people by giving them a say in a general election. People are worried sick out there. There are millions of struggling families and pensioners. They need more help.
The first big test for Rishi Sunak's premiership will come when his Chancellor makes a statement on tax and spending plans, scheduled for Monday, but there's talk of a delay. Before that, this lunchtime, Rishi Sunak's first Prime Minister's questions on his first full day in office. Jonathan Blake, BBC News.
Well, Rishi Sunak, as we've been hearing, is going to face the opposition leader Sir Keir Starmer in today's Prime Minister's questions. Very busy first full day for the incoming Prime Minister. And for more now on what may lie ahead for Rishi Sunak in number 10 Downing Street, let's talk to Emeritus Professor of Political History at the University of Nottingham, Stephen Fielding. First of all, in historic terms, Rishi Sunak is a very young Prime Minister, I think the youngest for a couple of centuries, also, of course, the first British Asian Prime Minister. He's kind of made history already, hasn't he?
Well, he has in personal terms, and also he's probably one of the least experienced of Prime Ministers, because he's only been in Parliament since 2015, so his rise has been remarkably swift. But I suspect that if there is going to be a Rishi Sunak legacy, he will hope that it isn't simply for being, the first Hindu to become Prime Minister. It's what he does in government, and I think that's where his big problems lie.
Well, I mean, obviously the economy, he talked about that as an economic crisis at the moment. There is some talk that this economic statement that was due on Monday, very, very important statement, may be delayed, that he and his Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, want a bit more time to get their options together.
Well, yes. I mean, as a consequence of Liz Truss standing down and Rishi Sunak coming in, there's bound to be some sort of tweaking to the programme that Hunt was putting together. There's new ministers that he's got to talk to, but also Sunak knows that, I mean, more than his new cabinet, which he can change, when he wants to, this statement will define the early stages of his prime ministership. And so he will want to make sure that what the Chancellor does is what he wants the Chancellor to do. So it's a really, really important moment. It's unfortunate it's being delayed because, of course, the markets are all just waiting, and any extra insecurity and uncertainty is not going to do the British economy any favours.
Yeah, we don't yet know if it is delayed, but we're going to keep our eye on that. Just in terms of his cabinet appointments, clearly he's trying to bring in members of all the different factions of the Tory party. He said to MPs they have to unite or die. What did you make of his choices? In particular, Suella Braverman back at the Home Office, very controversially, after being forced to resign just a few days ago over that security breach.
Well, he's had a big problem with his cabinet because any new Prime Minister wants to establish a new identity. They actually usually want to show that they're different from their predecessor, and they usually do that by having a different kind of cabinet. He's not been able to do that because his position is actually rather weak. He might have sort of been the only person to be put forward to be the new leader, but there's a lot of division in his party. So it was principally created, his cabinet, to kind of accommodate all the different wings. And Suella Braverman is there, I think, to accommodate the kind of hard right of his party, to reassure the European Research Group that he is on side and he is going to take immigration seriously. And that is also an issue that those who are remaining Conservative voters at the moment, that's an issue that they take very seriously. And if he's got any hope of clawing back any votes from the Labour Party, then immigration is probably something he needs to be seen to be doing something about. But of course, Braverman brings all kinds of baggage with her, which may or may not prove to be unfortunate in the future.
Yeah, I mean, Labour are saying today that Rishi Sunak did what they call a grubby deal with Suella Braverman to get her support for him in the crucial stages of the leadership contest.
Yes, she's credited with effectively killing off Boris Johnson's chances of becoming Conservative leader, because she came out and endorsed Rishi Sunak over the weekend. And as she was, one of the leaders of the European Research Group, one of those sort of people on the hard right, that was seen to be really the death knell of Boris Johnson's campaign. And apparently Sunak was very keen to get that endorsement. And, in private, of course, there will have been deals. And I suspect that this is a consequence of that deal. But as I say, she brings with her the support of that faction of the Conservative Party, which he desperately needs to be on side if his premiership is to survive, beyond Christmas to the next election, whenever.
Professor Stephen Fielding, thank you very much indeed. Let's go to Downing Street and join our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley, who's there for us. And Nick, that is the most controversial of all those cabinet appointments, Suella Braverman. And Labour are going to go on the attack on that. They've already been on the attack on that, saying, as I was just mentioning to the professor, that this was a grubby deal that Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman cooked up during the crucial stages of the leadership contest.
Yeah, morning to you, Ben. I can tell you the Home Secretary arrived in Downing Street a few minutes ago for the first meeting of the new cabinet. We asked her on our way in if she was a symbol of the professionalism and integrity that Rishi Sunak is promising in his operation. No answer from her. But yes, look, you're absolutely right. It is a controversial appointment. It was last week, just a week ago, that Ms Braverman was forced to resign by the last Prime Minister for breaking the ministerial code, for sending emails on her private account that related to government business. Now, there is also a subtext to this, which is there were big rows between Ms Truss and Ms Braverman about immigration. I just wonder if her appointment is a sign that Rishi Sunak is not going to relax immigration rules to try and boost economic growth, as some people have been asking him to do. But I think we will hear more about Ms Braverman's appointment over the course of the day. Labour are determined to push at what they think is a very controversial door and to continue to criticise her return to government so soon after being forced to resign.
And Nick, that may well be, I guess, one of the lines of attack at Prime Minister's questions for Sir Keir Starmer today. It's going to be a big test, isn't it, for the new Prime Minister? His first Prime Minister's questions in the bear pit of the House of Commons.
It's always a big moment for any Prime Minister, absolutely, for them to be in the chamber for the first time, seeing that 30 minutes of intense scrutiny from opposition and from your own backbench MPs. It's also quite a unique moment in the context of Rishi Sunak being Prime Minister, because he hasn't faced any scrutiny as part of this leadership campaign. Yes, we heard from him a lot over summer. Yes, we have a rough idea of what his broad parameters are, but things have of course changed. Since the summer, the economic picture has got worse. The government is now preparing for big cuts and potentially for tax rises too. We're just seeing the Armed Forces Minister, Johnny Mercer, arriving for cabinet here. But there is that question, Ben, about whether Rishi Sunak's plans have changed because of the economic picture changing. And today will be the first time he faces that scrutiny since Liz Truss announced that she was going to stand down. So we'll hear that from the Labour leader and from the SNP and from other opposition MPs later on today as well. There is also that question as the Conservative chairman, Nadhim Zahawi, arrives. Morning, Mr Zahawi. How bad are the cuts going to be? Can you save the economy? We asked that question, Ben, this morning because there's this question mark over whether the fiscal statement that the Chancellor has been drawing up is going to happen next Monday as planned. There have been some suggestions from government ministers this morning that that might not be as set in the diary as it had been. I suspect that the new Prime Minister will want to sit down with the Chancellor and go over the numbers, figure out if he can swallow some of the cuts that Mr Hunt has been working on. Political choices, of course, but something that Mr Hunt says he thinks is necessary to fill the fiscal black hole, which is about £40 billion a year based on what the OBR were saying a couple of weeks ago. So I think that will be on the agenda at the Cabinet. Let's see if by the end of the day we still expect to get those full details next Monday. Could well be that that's delayed by a few days.
Yeah, and that would be a bit of a difficulty perhaps for the Prime Minister and for the Chancellor, because any delay might just, well, I hesitate to say spook the markets, but it is going to be Halloween that it's meant to be on, but it might spook the markets if there's a delay or a significant delay of more than a few days.
I imagine there are some politicians who'd like to avoid some of those Halloween comparisons as well, Ben, given some of the headlines that could well be produced by a big fiscal event on Halloween. Look, there's a couple of things to bear in mind. A few days after, next Thursday is due to be the point at which the Bank of England makes its next decision on interest rates. There are a lot of Conservative MPs who want the government to set out more details of how it's going to balance the books before that decision is made, hoping that it will limit how much interest rates go up by. But then there is also that question, I think, for the new Prime Minister that, you know, he's been in office for less than 24 hours. He has to weigh up what his political priorities are, what he is prepared to sell to the country as economically required, as he would put it, to balance the books. It's a difficult moment, actually, because we know that the economic picture has got worse. We know that Rishi Sunak, when we were here yesterday, Ben, was telling the nation that there are difficult decisions to come, that he feels he has to clean up some of the mess left by his predecessor, Liz Truss. So that will be an important moment for him. It'll also tell us, though, a lot about his political priorities, the areas where he is prepared to cut back on spending or to introduce a bit of a spending squeeze. It really, really does matter for his political future. Here's the new Work and Pensions Secretary. Are benefits going to go up with inflation? I asked that question, Ben, because that is something Mel Stride has said he would be in favour of over the past few weeks, or at least said that he thinks the government would face a bit of a problem with backbenchers if it wanted to put benefits up by less than the rate of inflation. Rishi Sunak promised to do that when he was Chancellor. Then there's a question mark over it under Liz Truss. We don't really know what Mr Sunak thinks of it now, but we do know that he's got a new Work and Pensions Secretary, a very close ally, someone who ran his leadership campaign, the very short-lived 4-day one anyway, who has said in the past that he thinks the government will face real trouble if it tries to put benefits up by less than the rate of inflation.
All right, Nick, thank you. I do admire your persistence, by the way, in asking those questions to the arriving cabinet ministers when you pretty much know you're not going to get an answer. But keep going. Maybe you'll get some answers in the next few minutes. Nick Eardley there, our chief political correspondent in Downing Street. Well, among the appointments made to the cabinet yesterday, as we've been discussing, controversially, was Suella Braverman, reappointed as Home Secretary only 6 days after she had to resign from that job for sending an official document from her personal email address. Well, earlier on this morning, the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, was asked about Suella Braverman's reappointment.
The Home Secretary has said she made a mistake. She apologised for that. But she is also absolutely determined and focused to crack down on crime and to secure our borders and make sure that the Home Office is a very, very high functioning delivery department. And clearly that is what the Prime Minister has decided he needs and wants. And I think that is because the feedback that I get from my constituents is that that's what they want as well. And I suspect that is why he has chosen her to return to that incredibly important job.
And not because she promised to vote for him?
Well, I think what the numbers make clear is that the Prime Minister, Rishi, was way ahead when it came to the support of the parliamentary party. I doubt that really he needed any particular individual's endorsement. But what he has also made clear is that he wants all of government to be delivery focused from day one. That means getting people who understand the departments, have experience. I think that's one of the reasons why I was retained. And it's clear that Suella knows the Home Office, having very recently been there, and is able to hit the ground running from day one.
That's the Foreign Secretary, reappointed Foreign Secretary. How have the markets been reacting to the new Rishi Sunak government? And also that speculation we've been discussing with Nick Eardley that the economic statements, the crucial economic statement, which is due on Monday, might just be delayed a few days or even longer. Let's talk to our business correspondent, Peter Ruddick. How spooked would the markets be if there were a delay in that economic statement?
Yeah, well, I think they would certainly not be particularly pleased necessarily. I think we saw in the markets yesterday, both on government borrowing, the strength of the pound, and on the stock markets, a vote of confidence, I think, in the new administration, in the new Prime Minister. And they've perhaps got a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of time, a couple of days here and there. I think the markets would allow them. It doesn't feel at the moment, famous last words, it doesn't feel at the moment like we're back to sort of paying very close attention to the gilt markets and gilt yields every hour or so, which we have been in the past week or so. But I think they are going to be very closely watching this economic plan, and businesses will as well, not just markets, because I think the attention is going to turn now away from sort of the broad economic delivery to some of the specifics. You know, businesses need to know what's going to happen with energy bills. In just a few months' time, we know there's going to be some form of targeted support for businesses. Who's going to get it? What kind of level of support would that be? And I think there is some concern within businesses, we've heard it from business groups in the last few days, about whether there is an overcorrection coming. So the feeling is that unfunded tax cuts are clearly not the way to go for the markets and for the economy as a whole. But if the reverse of that is tax rises, spending cuts, a possible dent to consumer confidence, there's a fear that that could well harm growth and businesses' prospects for the future. So I think there's a bit of concern about a fear that there could be a bit of an overcorrection coming. So I think, as I say, markets, I think, ready to give a couple of days' time. If there is a little bit of a delay, I don't think we'll see massive market moves. But business groups, small and large businesses, really keen now on some of the detail, which I think they're going to want to hear sooner rather than later. And
Peter, what have the markets been doing ever since that mini budget? We know that, that was pretty much disastrous as far as the markets were concerned, and we saw the dramatic changes on the markets as a result of that. But to what extent in the last few weeks since then have they settled down?
Well, I mean, they certainly haven't settled down in the last few weeks. We've been
last few days.
Yeah. No. I mean, in the last couple of days, things really have returned. It's no exaggeration to say things really have returned to where they were before that mini budget, which caused all the chaos. The level of the pound back to the level it was before Kwasi Kwarteng delivered his so-called growth plan, and government borrowing, which is what we were paying such close attention to, that's now back to levels it was before the mini budget as well. Yeah, economic credibility is quickly lost and slowly regained, but government borrowing in particular, it's really important that has return to those levels before the mini budget, because that essentially means that the size of the fiscal hole that the new Chancellor has to fill may well be slightly smaller than it was just a week ago, for example.
Peter, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. And we're also joined now by our correspondent Ben Boulos, who's in Alfriston in Derbyshire, speaking to small business owners. Ben.
Yes, Ben, as the new Prime Minister is constructing his cabinet, the staff here are busy constructing garments. Have a look at Rachel's handiwork there. To me, this is just like magic, the way they turn those bits of cloth into finished items like this. But when you talk about businesses and the effect of the decisions made where you are in Westminster, it affects places like this. We're in Derbyshire. It employs 300 people, a lot of them here busily working this morning. And the factory has been here since 1961. Harold Macmillan was the Prime Minister back then when the business started up. They've seen their fair share of Prime Ministers over the decades. Indeed, they've seen quite a few, haven't they, over the last few weeks. But let's find out what people here would like to hear from Rishi Sunak as he outlines support for people with the cost of living crisis. I'm just going to interrupt you, Angie, from your work. What are the biggest pressures you're facing day to day?
Mine's grocery shopping. 3 years ago there was 4 of us, and now there's only 2 of us, and it still seems to be costing the same.
So less food costing the same?
Yes,
okay.
less food for your money.
Okay, Angie, thank you very much. Kelly, can I just reach across here and interrupt you as well? Angie was talking there about groceries. What are you finding the biggest cost pressures are that you'd like to see help with?
For me personally, it's definitely petrol, at least with my expenses. This last year in October with the same job, I spent £65 on petrol for the whole month, and this year it's been £100 for the month, and we're not even at the end of the month yet.
So it's really having an impact on your spending money.
It's a noticeable impact, and you notice it in other things too, because I've been looking for a house for the past year, and I've just been looking, and there used to be 1 or 2 houses that were up for auction for being repossessed, but now the vast majority have been repossessed that are just up for auction, and they're like family houses for like family of 5.
Of course, that is the harsh reality for so many people.
Yeah.
Kelly, thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us. I'll let them carry on working, try not to knock things as I go round. Let's speak to the boss here, Christopher Nieper. Christopher, with a business like this, you have a keen interest in what the government plans to do to help support firms like yours. What would you like to hear?
Well, the new Prime Minister talks about a profound economic crisis. In fact, that stems from a productivity problem, and that comes from a scarcity of skills. But let's not be too gloomy. There's terrific demand for quality British product around the country. We've had one of the best years ever. But I think we could solve this not by raising taxes or lowering taxes, but by unlocking talent in towns like this all around the country. There are millions of people in this country who could add to our productivity. So I suggest one of our previous Prime Ministers had a mantra: education, education, education. Why doesn't this Prime Minister start with skills, skills, skills?
Who knows? If he's watching this morning, he may well take that on board.
He's welcome to come and see us, and I will show him how we work with the local school and how we could make this work.
OK, Christopher, thank you very much. Let's get a bit of an overview with Melanie Ulliat from the Federation of Small Businesses. Melanie, what are businesses that you represent? 150,000 of them around the UK. What are they saying the biggest challenges for them are?
At the moment, it's got to be finance, access to finance, late payments. The Prime Minister could very easily solve some of this without any cost to the taxpayer by making sure that businesses get a fair price for their goods and services, but also get paid on time. It's costing our economy by not being paid on time. For example, 50,000 businesses a year go out of business by simple cash flow issues, by not being paid, access to finance, access to credit. All-time business confidence is low simply because they haven't got the staff and they haven't got the cash.
In terms of the reversal on the plans for corporation tax to come down to 19%, the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt said it won't come down, it will go up to 25%. What are businesses saying to you about that?
Well, it's been a confusing time for them, of course, and all businesses know that we need to pay tax, but there's got to be a fine balance with what's achievable and doable. With energy prices going up, fuel, insurances, labour costs, where are they simply going to find the money? There's got to be a proper regulatory framework in place now for business and a fair tax system. And looking at business rates, they've got to look at the holistic picture of finance when it comes to recovering the economy for small businesses.
And people who are watching this thinking, you know, business pressures are far removed from my life, this all feeds into decisions about staff pay rises, doesn't it?
All businesses want to pay their staff a fair wage, but when there simply isn't the money, what are they going to do? They have to make cutbacks, they haven't got enough staff to grow, and the biggest cost to most businesses is the manufacturing goods, or it is the staff. So they're going to have to make more cuts. Over the last 2 years, the small business community in the UK has shrunk by 500,000, and that's not a good roadmap for recovery.
OK, Melanie, thank you very much. Now, just before we finish up, take one last look at some of the handiwork going on here. This is Amy at this machine here. Very, very impressive work. There were a couple of spare machines. They invited me to sit down, have a go. I will be honest, I would have probably stitched my fingers to the desk rather than made anything that looked even vaguely sellable. Ben, I'm not sure how your work compares, but I'll leave that thought with you.
I think you should be learning a new skill. Why not, Ben? There's the opportunity. Spend a day there. I think you could really master that if you had a few hours. Ben Boulos, thank you very much. Good to see you. We're going to get a look at the weather now with Carol. It's a beautiful day here, actually. I thought I'd be wearing an overcoat. It's late October, but Carol's got the forecast.
That's absolutely right, Ben. It's a very mild start to the day and it's going to be a mild day generally. We've had two bands of rain. The first one moving northwards across Scotland. The second one doing the same thing, curving round into the southeast where it's really weak and we're looking at a bit of cloud, maybe the odd shower. But for most, it is going to be a dry day with just one or two showers. But it's going to be blustery, windy out towards the west with exposure. In fact, some very large waves today across the southwest of England and also through the Irish Sea up to about 3 metres. Something to consider if you're planning a day at the beach. Temperatures 12 to about 20 degrees. Now, as we head through the evening and overnight, many of the showers will fade. The cloud in the south is a weather front, which is going to move northwards, bringing more rain in across England and Wales. Another weather front bringing some rain in across western Scotland and a mild night in prospect. Tomorrow, all this rain moves northwards and eastwards. The rain across Scotland pushes northwards as well. There'll be some bright skies, cloudier in the north, but in the sunshine, we could hit 22 somewhere.
It's really a lot of fake news. Сейчас на українській телебаченні.
Minister, BBC.
Are they going to get past you, or are they going to get past you and these men?
How soon do you think it could be before there is real fighting here?
I just they couldn't come with you.
What do you read about what's happening on the ground?
Where were you at the exact time of the attack?
If that is what you think of him, how do you sit across the table to try to stop the war?
And we're live in 5, 4, 3.
Hello again, very good morning to you. You're watching BBC News with me, Ben Brown. We're live at Westminster today and ministers have been, been arriving for Rishi Sunak's first cabinet meeting this morning after the new Prime Minister warned that there will be tough choices ahead.
I will place economic stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. This will mean difficult decisions to come.
Perhaps the most controversial appointment was Suella Braverman back as Home Secretary, despite having broken the ministerial code only last week. The Foreign Secretary says Mr Sunak wanted an experienced team around him.
And it's clear that Suella knows the Home Office, having very recently been there, and is able to hit the ground running from day one.
The new Prime Minister's already been talking to the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales in what is being seen as an attempt to improve relations with the devolved administrations. At noon today, Rishi Sunak faces his first big parliamentary test in the new job. At Prime Minister's Questions in the Chamber of the House of Commons, we will have live coverage of that. Well, Rishi Sunak, the new Prime Minister, is chairing his first cabinet meeting before he then heads to Prime Minister's Questions a bit later on at midday. As we were saying, they're a big test for him. Our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley, is in Downing Street, and you've been watching the cabinet, the new cabinet, arrive this morning. In some ways, it's quite a lot of old faces, actually. There has been a sort of premium on stability and continuity.
Yeah, and experience, Ben. There are a lot of ministers who've been walking in over the last half hour or so who'll be quite familiar faces to cabinet watchers. People like Michael Gove back in the fold. The Foreign Secretary stayed the same. The Home Secretary, controversial appointment, but it's the same Home Secretary that it was a week ago. The Chancellor is still Jeremy Hunt. There's going to be a lot of eyes on Jeremy Hunt today because he was in here earlier discussing with the Prime Minister whether to delay the so-called medium-term fiscal plan, the cuts that we expect the government to announce, potential tax rises that he's been drawing up as well. We were expecting that plan on Monday. All the mood music this morning, though, is that is going to potentially be delayed. Not confirmed yet by the government, but certainly something that was being discussed. And I think that's because the new Prime Minister will want to have a look at the numbers, to dot a few of the I's and cross a few of the T's and figure out what he can sell politically that the new Chancellor wants to do. We know that there were some pretty rapid decisions made last week on things like keeping the triple lock on pensions. That was announced by Liz Truss at PMQs last week after a meeting with the Chancellor. But I wouldn't be surprised if by Prime Minister's questions we're talking about that fiscal plan being delayed by a while. Quite how long, I'm not sure. I think the government will want to do it sooner rather than later. And the Bank of England is due to announce its next interest rate decision next Thursday. There are many Conservative MPs who want the government to set out more of its fiscal plans before then. But let's wait and see what happens. It seems that there's a good chance that there'll be a delay to that fiscal plan.
Let's just throw ahead to Prime Minister's questions at midday, Nick, and you know, Rishi Sunak's first taste of the gladiatorial combat in the chamber of the House of Commons at PMQs. You just wonder what is Sir Keir Starmer's line of attack during Prime Ministers, because in a sense you could argue, I suppose, with Boris Johnson he had a few open goals with the Partygate allegations, with Liz Truss a few open goals with the disaster of the mini budget. How does he go on the attack against the new Prime Minister, do you think?
I think Labour's argument today, Ben, will be that although there's a new Prime Minister, the governing party are the ones responsible for the mess that the country's in, and he will pick on the fact that there are a lot of cabinet ministers who are familiar faces and say they're the ones responsible for all the problems that the country and the economy are facing at the moment. But it is a big moment for Rishi Sunak, and it's a sort of a peculiar moment actually, because we saw Mr Sunak on Monday, we saw him on Tuesday giving pre-prepared statements, not taking any questions. He still hasn't done any interviews in the last few weeks. We've not really heard from him in any real detail since the summer when he lost the leadership election to Liz Truss. Well, he's now Prime Minister, and at PMQs today at noon in the Commons, we're going to see the first time that his new plans face any real scrutiny. And there will be a lot of scrutiny because the economic picture is different to the one that we had over the summer. We know that the cost of borrowing, for example, has gone up. That puts a bit more of a squeeze on what the government can do. We know that the Treasury is looking at the moment at a £40 billion black hole, which it has to fill. That is going to mean, because of the choices that the Chancellor is making, that there are probably spending cuts to come and probably tax rises to accompany them. And, you know, that means that Mr Sunak is going to have to set out to the country exactly what his priorities are. There are some interesting cabinet appointments actually that might give us a flavour of where some of his priorities do lie. One of the ones that arrived in the last half hour was Mel Stride, a key ally of Rishi Sunak, who's now the Work and Pension Secretary. Well, a couple of weeks ago at the Conservative conference, Mr Stride was saying that he thinks the government will be in real trouble with backbenchers if it doesn't increase benefits by the rate of inflation. That's something that's going to be expensive. It's something that the government hasn't committed to in the last few weeks, although it is something that Mr Sunak said he would do when he was Chancellor. So I just wonder, is that a sign maybe that the Work and Pension Secretary is being put in place to oversee benefits going up by the rate of inflation? We don't know for sure, but one of the reasons we don't know is because Mr Sunak hasn't faced those questions just yet. Noon today on BBC News, Prime Minister's questions, we'll see some of that scrutiny happen.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to watch, and we'll be getting your assessment later. Nick Eardley there, thank you, our chief political correspondent. And let's also talk to the broadcaster Ayesha Hazarika, the former Labour advisor for Gordon Brown, Harriet Harman and Ed Miliband. Ayesha, good to have you with us. What do you think is Keir Starmer's line of attack? Do you think for Keir Starmer and for Labour in general, Rishi Sunak is a more formidable opponent than Liz Truss?
So I did think that yesterday morning, and particularly when Rishi Sunak made what was a very accomplished, elegant a slick speech on the steps of Downing Street, talking about being a compassionate Conservative and talking about bringing back professionalism and integrity to the cabinet. And I thought at that moment, yes, I think Labour is going to have a bit more of a challenge from Rishi Sunak. To be fair, it's not exactly difficult to provide more challenge than Liz Truss did. But I think his cabinet reshuffle has really, really undermined that very persuasive, compelling argument he himself made with the appointment of particularly Suella Braverman. You cannot make an argument about professionalism and integrity and have somebody back at the Department of Homeland Security who just a few days ago breached security rules and breached the ministerial code. And of course, we know that he's done that because his party is still very, very divided. So I think this does give the Labour Party a very good attack line, which is he may be this very interesting, shiny new face, but it is essentially the old band back together. And that was a band which was very recently getting booed off stage.
James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, was saying about that Suella Braverman appointment, well, it's about experience, it's about stability, continuity. She's going back to the job she was doing just a few days ago.
She had hardly been in that position. And in the time when she had been Home Secretary, she was only brought in as Home Secretary a couple of weeks ago, I think sort of 6-7 weeks ago by Liz Truss. She didn't achieve anything of great note while she was Home Secretary, apart from saying some quite distasteful things about having a dream of rounding up asylum seekers and sending them to Rwanda. We know that's a policy that A, is unworkable, potentially breaches international law, and is actually costing the taxpayer a lot of money. We also know that she played a part in really creating obstacles to a big trade deal with India because she wouldn't yield on some of her very hardline views on immigration. And if you want to have growth, you are going to have to liberalise some of the immigration rules. So I think this argument that she's this really experienced old hand at the Home Office is absolute nonsense. And she broke the ministerial code and security rules just 6 days ago. I think if Rishi Sunak wanted somebody serious with experience back at the Home Office, Sajid Javid would have been an obvious appointment.
What about Labour more generally now? Because they have been, of course, calling for a general election immediately. That is not going to happen, it's pretty clear. Do they need to do more now to explain their policies? You know, we know some of the specifics, obviously, windfall tax and so on. But do they need to be going on the offensive a little bit more than they have been, perhaps in recent weeks, where they have, you know, watched the Liz Truss government fall apart? They watched the Boris Johnson government fall apart. They didn't have to do that much in opposition. Now, do you think they have to do a little bit more?
I think that is a fair point. I mean, although from a strategic point of view, when your enemy is making an absolute mess of it, it is best to sit back and let them carry on with it. So I think Labour will want to allow Rishi Sunak some time to set out the contours of his government, particularly around this economic event that we were hoping would happen on Halloween, but it might be delayed by a few days or so. So I don't think Labour's going to feel under any pressure to set out specific tax and spend plans now. Why would they? As soon as they issue any details, everyone will start pulling it apart. And also the economy is changing very quickly as well. But I do think you do have a point in the sense that Labour can't just coast and bank on the fact that they have got a big poll lead. Rishi Sunak may well get a bounce. The election is a long time away. Labour will have to put more flesh on the bone. If Labour's argument is, look, we're a government in waiting, we are ready to go, then they have a duty to tell the public a bit more about their direction of travel.
Do you think Rishi Sunak gets a kind of honeymoon period as the new Prime Minister?
Do you know, I think he would have had a bigger honeymoon period if it wasn't for the return of people like Suella Braverman and, you know, Gavin Williamson, who is basically seen as like a sort of comedy figure, the sort of Frank Spencer of British politics. I think if he had brought back some more serious people, I think he would have had a longer honeymoon period. But there is no doubt he very much looks the part. He's far more articulate and slick than any of his predecessors have been in Downing Street for quite some time. But I just feel he's undermined a lot of the goodwill that there was for him yesterday by this reshuffle.
He is also young. He's 42. He's the youngest Prime Minister for a couple of centuries in modern British political history, the first British Asian Prime Minister as well. So he is making history apart from anything that he actually does in office.
Absolutely, and that is something which really should be celebrated. I am the child of Indian immigrants. My parents and I were just talking yesterday. You could hear the pride in their voices. You know, I felt very proud when I saw Rishi Sunak. There's pictures of him with King Charles. That's a huge moment which we should celebrate, just as we celebrated Sadiq Khan becoming the Muslim mayor of London. I think on many levels there is a very proud story to be told about diversity in this country, but that doesn't give Rishi Sunak a free pass, particularly when so many people right now are really worried about their own finances. People are facing life on the poverty line. People are very angry after the disastrous mini budget that we saw. But there is no doubt his elevation to Prime Minister is a big moment. And given that Britain has been quite an international laughing stock on the international stage, all eyes are on Britain now in a good way, because Rishi Sunak has made history by being the first British Asian Prime Minister. But it is important to note that is important and that is good, but he does not have a mandate from the public.
Aisha, very good to talk to you. Always good to talk to you and get your analysis. Aisha Hazarika there, former Labour advisor. Thank you very much for your time. Well, the Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, who was reappointed to the role in the new cabinet, is to hold talks with Stormont party leaders as Friday's deadline to restore an executive draws ever closer. If it's missed, another election would have to take place within 12 weeks. So let's get the latest from our correspondent in Belfast, Charlotte Gallagher. Charlotte, just bring us up to date with what the reaction there has been to the new government of Rishi Sunak.
The reaction has been pretty much, Ben, that it doesn't matter who's in charge in Westminster, they have to sort out Northern Ireland. It has to be a priority. The DUP and Sinn Féin have all said they'll work with whoever is the Northern Ireland Secretary, but something really does need to be done about Stormont, the lack of devolved government, and the issues need to be sorted. There hasn't been a functioning devolved government here since February. That's an incredibly long amount of time when decisions aren't being made about healthcare, education, for example. So people here, voters, are really fed up. And as you said, there's this deadline looming Friday. If the devolved government isn't back at Stormont working by then, Chris Heaton-Harris has said he will call an election. And Steve Baker, who's his minister, said there would be absolutely no U-turn on that issue. So realistically, I think there's little chance of them getting back to Stormont before Friday, because the DUP have said they will only go back once the Northern Ireland Protocol, so those post-Brexit trading arrangements, are either scrapped or significantly altered. And they've said they won't go back until there's action on that. They won't take it on a promise. So for the chance of that happening in the next 2 days, there would really have to be a miracle. So yes, we are looking at another election here in Northern Ireland in the weeks before Christmas, the last thing that voters want and the last thing really that politicians want. But Chris Heaton-Harris says this is a legal deadline and he's been left with no option. He's having these talks today with leaders of the different parties. The Assembly is going to be recalled tomorrow here as well, but the likelihood is there's still going to be a stalemate here.
Yeah, and when you said people there are fed up, I mean, what are they saying about what seems to be an endless political stalemate at the moment?
Quite a few people have said to me they've voted in every election, but they're just not going to bother voting this time. They've said they've had enough because what's the point in their view? If Stormont isn't going to get back together, if it's not going to be working, why should they go out in the weeks before Christmas, in the dark, in the cold, to vote again? So obviously a lot of die-hard voters, people will still vote, but a lot of people are thinking, well, are we just going to have this situation again when the results come in, that the Democratic Unionist Party is saying we're not going to go back and then Stormont again will collapse? And that could well happen if, after the election results come in, there still isn't a deal on the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, Rishi Sunak is seen as a bit more conciliatory about the protocol. He's ready perhaps to make a deal with the EU, not as hard line as his predecessors, but this has to be a deal agreed with the UK and the EU, and one that parties in Northern Ireland are happy with. And it's not just them as well. Interestingly, Rishi Sunak had his first phone call last night with the US President Joe Biden. Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement was brought up. Joe Biden hasn't made a trade deal yet with the UK. And I think a lot of that hangs on whether things can get back working in Northern Ireland. We know he's a president who really stresses his Irish roots. It's very important to him, and he's put real emphasis on the continuation of the Good Friday Agreement here and getting things back to normal.
Charlotte, good to talk to you. Thank you very much. Charlotte Gallagher there for us in Belfast. Well, directors of public health in England are urging the government not to make further cuts to their budgets. They say local authorities are on a financial cliff edge and that any more reductions in funding will hit the poorest communities hardest. Our health correspondent Dominic Hughes has this report.
This is what public health in action looks like.
Hi, I'm Carol. I'm from the Quit Smoking team.
Anthony is a smoker, but with a fractured foot and shoulders, he's now stuck in Gateshead's Queen Elizabeth Hospital.
So how many cigarettes do you normally smoke a day, Anthony?
10 at the most.
So Carol, one of the hospital's stop smoking advisors, sees a chance to help Anthony quit.
We can offer you some patches for your arm.
Yes.
And we can give you like an inhalator, you know, it's something to do with your hands.
Yes.
While you're,
yes,
and that's full of nicotine as well.
Carol herself gave up smoking 5 years ago. She understands how hard it can be.
If I can do it, anybody can, and I did it. So you can as well.
And she fears what might happen if this kind of service didn't exist.
I just think people will die sooner because they're not getting the support that they need. And I think now if we're educating the grannies, the mothers, they're going to educate their children not to smoke as well, because it's them that's the future, isn't it?
And on the respiratory ward, the medical team can see that Carol's work is getting results.
If I can help support a patient diagnosed with lung cancer to stop smoking, they live longer, as powerful as having palliative chemotherapy. So it has real impact straight away, being able to offer these services, and if they get cut, it'll just be devastating. It's a critical tool in my armoury.
In England, public health measures like stop smoking services are funded by local authorities, with a grant from the Department for Health and Social Care worth £3.4 billion this year. But budgets have been squeezed hard over the last decade, and now rising inflation means the money is getting spread ever more thinly.
The public health grant has been cut by around a quarter since 2015-16, and with higher than expected inflation at the moment, we're expecting another real term cut this year.
A fresh analysis of what impact that's had on public health spending since 2015 shows where reductions have already been made. Stop smoking services have been hardest hit, with budgets down by more than 40%. Money for adult drug and alcohol services has been reduced by more than a quarter, and sexual health services saw funding fall by more than 20%. And in communities like Gateshead, with areas of severe deprivation, talk of further budget cuts is a bleak prospect.
It really concerns me. You know, I'm here to improve and protect the health and well-being of the population in Gateshead, and actually having some of the limitations around budgets is really concerning. So if you take tobacco, for example, tobacco harm in Gateshead costs about £62 million a year, about £9 million to the NHS. So if we were reducing some of those services that help us to tackle that issue, it doesn't make any sense.
The Department for Health and Social Care says public health grants for next year will be announced in due course, but the worry is that double-digit inflation will mean vital services will be lost and the health of the poorest communities will suffer. Dominic Hughes, BBC News, Gateshead.
Well, Rishi Sunak has claimed he will deliver levelling up, but with inflation running at just over 10%, eating into government budgets and spending cuts in prospect, what chance is there of levelling up places like Blyth and Bishop Auckland and Burnley? Well, amidst days dominated by political movements here at Westminster, Seema Katecha has been talking to families to see how the cost of living crisis is hitting them.
Louisa's on her half-term break, and her grandparents have brought her here to this place on the outskirts of Burnley, where ponies and horses rescued from cruelty are taken care of. But people are feeling the pain of the economic crisis, with some contemplating cutting back on day trips to save a few pounds.
My granddaughter absolutely loves coming here, and I do bring her quite often. It's £5, which is not a lot of money, But, you know, if you keep coming once a week, it does add up. I try my best to give to charities. I do donate through my wage every week through work, which I've done for the last 20 years, donated £5. But to be honest, I am actually thinking, am I going to have to stop this because I maybe can't afford it anymore?
And the older visitors are nervous about the winter months.
Even though our pensions may not go up, we are managing, but the biggest worry is that our heating has got to be on all day. I also do quite a lot of cooking, so we are quite anxious about the next bills and what they're going to be like, and we're trying to sort of take precautions to keep the heating down if we can.
Yes, there's a new Prime Minister, but the cost of living crisis remains. And what is palpable from speaking to people here in Burnley at places like this is that it's affecting all sections of society, with some telling us they're optimistic about the new administration, while others are saying they're terrified about what could lie ahead.
We're going to feel it. We feel the crunch already, and we're just sort of getting our heads around the fact that winter's always difficult anyway. So for us, we're kind of preparing and asking people to give what they can and accept that sometimes that might not always be what they've been able to afford in the past.
The cafe on site is paying more for its food, like the rest of society. Here they tell us food inflation is impossible to ignore. And means a weekly shop isn't what it used to be.
Just everything's gone up, especially the products like fruit and veg that I use a lot, and margarine's gone up a lot, so yeah.
And what about the basics you feed these children?
Yeah, that's been really affected in the shop. You're just not getting as much in your trolley as you used to.
It's clear the government has some tough choices to make, with a massive financial hole worth billions of pounds to fill.
Lovely day here at Westminster. Carol's got the weather forecast for all of us. I mean, honestly, it's so warm here, Carol, I could be wearing a T-shirt.
It certainly could, Ben. At the moment, the temperature in London is 17 degrees. And for many of us, it's been a really mild start to the day. And that mild theme is going to continue for the next few days, by day and also by night. Today, it's also going to be blustery, windier than it has been in the last few days. And as the rain clears, what you'll find is we'll see a return to sunshine and showers. Low pressure is firmly in charge of our weather at the moment, with its fronts dragging the rain northwards and eastwards. And you can see just by looking at those isobars that it is windy, but the wind is coming from a very mild direction, namely from the south, dragging the mild or very mild conditions across our shores. So the first band of rain is almost cleared. We've got some heavy rain moving currently across Scotland, pushing steadily northeastwards. Then behind it we see a return to bright spells, sunny spells and some showers. A bit more cloud at times, the dregs of the weather front in the far southeast, and blustery. These are the temperatures we can expect, 12 to about 19 or 20 degrees. But the wind will be a feature across the Irish Sea and also the Western Isles, because here it will be pretty gusty and it will be producing some large waves around the southwestern approaches and also the Irish Sea. Something to consider if you're tempted to go down to the shoreline today. Now, as we head on through the evening and overnight, many of the showers will fade. Our weather front in the south producing this cloud flips round and moves back northwards, taking its rain across parts of England and Wales with it. Another weather front comes into the west, introducing some rain, and the wind will strengthen. We're looking at severe gales with exposure around the Outer Hebrides. Again, here too, there'll be large waves whipped up, and it's going to be a mild night across the board. So tomorrow all of this rain moves northwards and also eastwards. The rain in Scotland pushes northwards, and what we'll be left with in Scotland and Northern Ireland is a fair bit of cloud, whereas for England and Wales we'll start to see some holes develop in that cloud and some sunshine come through. Now, depending on how much sunshine we get, we could hit 22 Celsius somewhere in the southeast, but generally our range will be 13 to 20 degrees. As we head into Friday, low pressure is still with us. A weather front crosses quite smartly from the west towards the east, taking its rain with it. And then behind it, we're back into some sunshine, 1 or 2 showers, and temperatures still 12 to about 20 degrees. And then as we head into the weekend, the weather will be changeable. At times we'll see some rain, but that is going to move through quite quickly. Then it'll be sunshine and showers and brisk winds on Sunday.
We'll lift everything.
Behind every headline, there is a human story. This is our world.
The lieu, Carter.
A series of documentary films that reveal the human drama at the heart of global events.
Життя триває, у нас 2 дітей.
Our World, this weekend on the BBC News Channel and iPlayer.
With midterm elections approaching, the American people prepare to make their voices heard on everything from inflation to crime and relations with Russia and the war in Ukraine. We travel the country, talking to voters about where they stand on the big issues. And we'll break down the impact of the upcoming elections on the US and the rest of the world. Follow the US midterm elections on the BBC News Channel and online.